He tracked my sighs, judged my winks, and called my happiness clandestine. But when he thought he owned my productivity, I was ready to take back my soul. This is the story of how a tiny black box turned into the ultimate symbol of corporate tyranny. The office used to be sanctuary. It was a room the size of a small living area, bathed in the afternoon light that slanted through the north-facing window, illuminating the dust motes dancing over my vintage cherry wood desk. It smelled faintly of old paper, strong coffee, and the clean, almost sterile scent of good productivity. For 3 years, it was my escape hatch from the relentless, beige tyranny of corporate life. I worked remotely for StellarCorp, a company that prided itself on being modern and trusting. A marketing phrase I learned to translate in my head as, "We trust you, until we don't." I liked the solitude. I liked that when I closed the door, the demands of the quarterly review and the incessant chime of the Slack notification could be temporarily muffled. I could be myself in there. I could be the person who actually enjoyed his work, not just the automaton executing tasks on a glowing screen. My little office was where the work met the life, and it was a perfect, symbiotic relationship. Then Marcus arrived. Marcus wasn't a terrible man, not necessarily. He was merely an architect of microaggressions, a connoisseur of data points, and a zealot for the metric. He believed that trust was a fragile commodity, easily corrupted by a slightly delayed response or a moment of creative distraction. He didn't want output, he wanted proof of output. He wanted the digital receipt proving every millisecond of my existence had been maximally utilized. The change began subtly, a faint hum that only I seemed to hear at first. It started with the new VPN connection, which felt heavier, slower, like walking through wet cement. Then came the dashboard. My familiar task list now had a glowing, insidious little circle next to my name, constantly updating, active, typing, idle, in review. But the true infestation, the thing that made my stomach clench with a slow, burning resentment, was the physical hardware. Hidden beneath the monitor stand, nestled like a technological parasite, was a small, sleek black box. It looked like a high-end Wi-Fi extender, but I knew better. It was the corporate eye. A week after the box appeared, the mic activation became a thing of ritual. I would start a meeting, and instead of a simple "ready," the system would announce a bright, authoritative chime, followed by a gentle, synthesized voice that sounded suspiciously like a polite butler, a mic active, capturing vocal data. It was passive-aggressive to the extreme. It implied, without saying it, that I was a potentially unreliable specimen under observation. It escalated quickly past mere monitoring and entered the territory of judgment. One Tuesday afternoon, I was deep in a flow state. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of code. The logic tangled like cheap yarn, and I needed a quick, mental break. I leaned back, sighed deeply, a massive, cleansing sigh, and muttered aloud, "God, this is going to take a week." The chime went off. Activity log entry, verbalization detected. Content analysis, frustration/delay anticipated. Before I could even blink, a notification popped up on the corner of the screen, colored a judgmental shade of burnt orange. Note: employee demonstrated low-level emotional expenditure, frustration. Suggestion: mandatory 5-minute ocular rest period. It was humiliating. It was invasive. It was the digital equivalent of Marcus leaning over my shoulder, hands clasped, saying, "Are you truly satisfied with this progress? And why are you sighing like a distressed walrus?" The zenith of the absurdity came on Thursday. I had a lunch break, but rather than eating at my desk, I took a short walk to the small balcony. I needed to feel the sun on my skin and hear the birds instead of the whirring fan. While outside, I pulled out my phone, needed to check a text from my sister. and sent a rapid-fire Slack message to a colleague, Jane. Using an emoji that was perhaps slightly too expressive, a winking, conspiratorial face. The chime went off. Communication event detected, off-cycle interaction. Emotional valence, playful/clandestine. And then, the ultimate gut punch. Marcus didn't just log the interaction, he annotated it. Within 30 seconds, a private message appeared, addressed only to me, but feeling like it was screamed directly into my ear canal, John. Regarding the Slack message sent to Jane, 1:17 p.m. EST. The use of the winking emoji suggests a potential departure from strictly procedural engagement. While acceptable, such clandestine communication warrants review. Are you attempting to imply that the deliverable is somehow enjoyable? Provide context. Enjoyable? The gall of the man. He didn't just see a winking emoji, he saw a tiny, subversive act of joy and immediately needed to dissect it, quantify it, and force me to justify my happiness. He treated my private office, my sanctuary, not as a workspace, but as a highly scrutinized petri dish where every tiny biological function had to be justified to his tyrannical oversight. That was the moment the simmering rage stopped being a simmer and became a rolling, volcanic boil. It was no longer about the tasks. It was about the ownership. It was about him, this petty, controlling man, believing he had the right to audit the quality of my lunch break, the efficiency of my deep sigh, and the sheer emotional tenor of my conversation with my sister. He didn't want my work, he wanted my soul. Logged and categorized into a spreadsheet column labeled engagement level. The injustice wasn't just that he watched. It was that he assumed the right to judge. He assumed that because he held the corporate keys, he held the keys to my personal interior life, and that my life was merely a series of inputs leading to predictable outputs. I sat there, staring at the burnt orange notification. The corporate little god laughing at my expense. The weight of the surveillance box, the black, silent, utterly smug piece of plastic, suddenly felt immense. It felt like the physical manifestation of his arrogance. I glanced toward the desk lamp, then at the monitor, which was displaying a perfectly rendered, pristine Gantt chart of my week. Underneath the chart, the monitoring software was displaying a live feed of my cursor movement, tracking the precise velocity of my mouse as I scrolled through a document. Optimal scroll velocity achieved, 420 pixels per second. Current state, engaged, optimal. I confirmed it. Everything was cataloged. Every movement, every breath, every playful flick of digital mischief. The thought process wasn't agonizing, it was sudden and crystalline. It didn't require debate or strategy, it required execution. He wanted control, he wanted proof. He wanted the system to acknowledge his absolute authority. I would give him the ultimate, irreversible proof. I rose from my chair. My movements were deliberate, slow, imbued with a terrifying calm. The rage was still there, a fierce, hot energy, but it had been channeled, refined, forged into a weapon. I walked around the desk, reaching for the small, black box. It was heavier than it looked. Solid, densely packed with processing power and the sheer, suffocating weight of Marcus's neediness. I lifted it out from beneath the stand. It was warm to the touch, vibrating almost imperceptibly. The sound of a million data points being amassed, waiting judgment. I carried it over to the workbench, where I had my little graveyard of components and tools. I picked up my toolkit, a hefty industrial screwdriver, a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, and a small, satisfyingly chunky soldering iron. The act of preparation was meditative. I didn't yank it out, I unwrapped it carefully, like unwrapping a prize. A prize I intended to dismantle and corrupt. The casing popped open with a precise, muted click. Inside, a riot of tiny circuit boards, miniature LED indicators, and a main processing chip waited, exposed, vulnerable. I looked at the exposed motherboard. There, running along a fine, green stripe, was the pathway of his control. The brain of the little beast. The screwdriver went to work first. It was a slow, satisfying process of peeling back the protective shielding, prying the components free, clink, scrape, thunk. Each sound was a tiny declaration of war. Next, the wire cutters. I snipped the power lead that fed the small device. It wasn't a clean cut, though. I pressed down with the cutters, causing a small, sparking burst of electricity to fly off the copper strands. It smelled faintly of ozone and victory. But simply unplugging it felt too merciful, too simple. Marcus would just have to swap the cable. The soldering iron was the final instrument of vengeance. I carefully heated the main power regulator chip. As the metal glowed red-hot, I pressed the tip against the chip. And with a firm, calculated pressure, I shorted the primary circuit. The effect was immediate and beautiful. A tiny, high-pitched whine erupted from the device. A sound that had been masked by the ambient hum of the office fan. The indicator LEDs, which had been blinking a steady, smug blue, suddenly flared into a frantic, epileptic dance of red and yellow. Then, with a final, pathetic little puff of smoke that smelled sweetly of burnt plastic and burnt data, the device gave up. It didn't just shut down. It died a dramatic, spectacular death. The noise stopped. The frantic blinking ceased. The micro-whine faded into a final, exhausted pop. Total silence. In the sudden vacuum, the little office felt different. It felt breathable. It felt mine again. I held the now inert black box in my hand. It was warm, slightly singed, and utterly, beautifully dead. I walked back to the desk and picked up my monitor. The corporate dashboard, which had been cycling through its endless stream of judgmental updates, suddenly froze. The vibrant, terrible blue of the active indicator flickered, flashed a desperate, dying yellow, and then settled into a flat, defeated, absolute black. The little butler voice, which had been so irritatingly present, emitted one final, truncated sound, mic. And then nothing. Just the pure, unadulterated silence of the untracked. The cursor, which had been scrolling with relentless, dutiful precision, stopped mid-sentence. For a full minute, I just stared at the screen, letting the weight of the silence settle over me. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of the tyranny having been choked out of existence. It was the perfect, resonant harmony of righteous anger. I didn't feel the need to rush. I didn't feel the need to dramatically lean back in my chair or punch the desk. The calm was too satisfying for that. Instead, I opened a new document, a blank page, pristine white, ready for the first stroke of genius. I pulled out my favorite fountain pen, the one that felt heavy and expensive in my hand, and began to write. I wrote the first sentence, slow and deliberate: the code is solved, and the process is optimal. Then I paused, looking at the dead box nestled beside the monitor. The monitoring system was off. The metrics were paused. The boss could see the final, perfect state of my productivity, but he could no longer dictate the emotional context of it. I leaned into the desk, a genuine, slow smile spreading across my face. A smile that wasn't designed to preemptively justify itself. I wrote the second sentence, and this one held the subversive payload, the perfect, final act of revenge. It was a whisper, but it carried the force of an explosion. The code is solved, and the process is optimal, despite the egregious, unnecessary intrusion of your personal anxieties into my otherwise perfectly executed life. And as I finished the sentence, I tapped the key, sending the document, complete with the flawless Gantt chart, off to Marcus. He would see the words. He would see the perfection of the output. He would see the victory. But for the first time in months, he wouldn't be able to log the winking emoji. He couldn't critique the sigh. He couldn't even log the sheer, radiant, undeniable smugness of my quiet, profound satisfaction. He just had to see it. And that, more than anything, was enough.